Hi guys, in today's lesson I'm going to talk to you about some different styles of writing with narratives that you can think about, which will help you to plan and then to write your own narrative. So let's get started with the plot and the narrative structure. The plot is the series of events that makes up the story or the narrative. The way in which the timeline of the story is organized is called the narrative structure. To be able to write within a narrative structure, you need to know about how the events are structured and consider the effect this will have on your audience. So on the task sheet, when I went through that, I talked to you guys about the linear narrative, which is where the narrative is told in order that the events happened in time, so from the beginning to the end. And they generally follow the following stages. So they've got an orientation, the rising action, which can also be called the conflict, which is on your task sheet, the climax, the falling action, where the character's sorting out how to solve the problem, and the resolution and evaluation, where the character resolves the problem and reflects on what they've learnt or how they've grown. And this is an image of how the linear narrative looks. So we start out with the orientation. Things are moving pretty smoothly, but then suddenly the action starts to rise as conflicts start to occur in the character's life. So things start getting a little bit complicated or going a little bit wrong. The climax, remember, is the dramatic high point. So that's the worst possible thing that could happen that will happen in the story, and your character's pretty much freaking out. Then slowly the character goes through the falling action or the resolution, where they work out their problem, they get over it somehow, they take some action to solve the problem, and finally the problem is resolved and that evaluation can take place where the character can reflect on their journey. So in this presentation I'm going to talk a bit as well about some of the styles of non-linear narratives, which, if I just go back, still have all of these 5 elements, but they're structured in a different way to keep your audience engaged. There are 5 of these. You could choose any of them, or you could stick with the traditional linear structure. So there's a number of ways to structure stories apart from a chronological sequence. The first one that you might think about using is flashbacks. This is where the narrative moves backwards and forwards between present and past events. And often the past events that are revealed throughout the story help to clarify or maybe complicate the present situation. So the more you find out in the flashbacks about the character or their past, the more complicated the present might become. I'm sure you've seen movies that are set out like that. The second one is a great structure to use. It's called the circular structure. It's where the narrative begins just after the climax, and then it takes readers back to the beginning to explain the events leading to this point and then beyond. So I'll just take you back to the picture. The story would start here or here, so during or just after the climax. The audience is going, oh my God, what a terrible thing to happen. How did they get to this point? And then the author takes the reader back to the orientation to describe the characters and setting, explain what happened to lead up to this crisis point. They meet back at where they began, and then slowly they can explain how the character resolves and gets out of this terrible position, and explain the resolution and the evaluation. So that's one more option. The next option is called nesting or a frame structure. This is where stories sit inside other stories. For example, where a play might be performed inside a movie, telling its own story within the story. Or letters or emails or text messages could be embedded in a novel or a narrative and could tell whole stories within themselves. So you might have a historical fiction based on a character who is in love with someone who's gone to war, and part of the story is the stories that are told through their letters to each other, but then of course you need to explain the story going on around those letters. So nesting, you can imagine the nest is the whole narrative, and then the little eggs are the little stories inside that tell a different story on their own, maybe letters or emails, etc. The next one is a tricky one to do, but you could give it a go if you're interested, is the reverse structure, where you tell the story backwards from the end to the beginning. So you start with the resolution and the evaluation, and then you explain the climax that happened, the conflict that led the character to that point, and the orientation is kind of told through those things, but you'll have a bit of an orientation, or maybe you'll save the evaluation till the end, where the character can reflect on how that whole process shaped who they are today. And finally, this one will be tricky to do in such a short word count, but you could give it a go. It's called the episodic story, episodic being a word based on episodes. So the story is told as a series of individual episodes. Gaps are left in the narrative so that the reader has to infer what has happened between episodes. So you could tell a story about some kind of development that happened in this area in the past, and there's a couple of options. You might tell part of the story and then pick up 6 months down the track. Each time you might leave a 6-month gap. You could leave a year gap or a month, or you could, flick between the seasons or something like that to have kind of snapshots of the story, and the reader has to work out how to link them together. So there are 5 options that you could choose: the flashbacks, the circular structure, nesting, reverse structure, and episodic stories. I'm just going to stop you there. I forgot to say at the start of the video, what I want you to do while you're watching this video is to take some notes in your English book or on a laptop, which might be tricky because you're watching this video. So please just maybe rewind it a little bit and keep some notes so that you can refer back to them, because we'll have some discussions about this in our next lesson. So please be taking notes. Very easy. Okay, let's move on. The next thing we'll talk about is the narrative viewpoint and narrative voice, which are 2 different things, which I'll explain. So when we read a story, we see images in our mind and hear a voice in our heads. Writers can choose whose eyes we see through and whose voice we hear telling the story. That's your choice, how you're going to do that. So narrative voice, take some notes on this. Narrative voice is the unique quality, tone, or style, it says under there, that a narrator brings to their storytelling. The voice of the narrator will reflect their personality, experiences, age, status, attitudes, and beliefs. While these attitudes, ideas, personalities may be similar to the author's, it's important to remember that the narrator is not necessarily the same person as the author. So the narrative voice might show a different personality or experience than the actual author's voice. For example, I could write a story about an old man, and he might be telling the story. So when I'm writing the story, I have to put myself into his shoes, think about his personality, experiences, and ideas. I, as the author, might not be a very judgmental person, but perhaps when I jump into this other character's shoes, I become a very judgmental and prejudiced character who judges everyone on maybe their gender or their race or that kind of thing. So it's different from the voice of the author. Okay, some things to think about. Whose perspective is the narrative told from? The first option is first-person narrative. This is where a character tells their own story. An example of first-person narration is, when I woke, the sun was streaming in our window, and I wished I was somewhere else. First person uses lots of I've forgotten the word. Lots of words like I, me, my, our, us. The next option is second person. The narrator tells the story as if it is happening to the reader. This style of perspective is quite uncommon. For example, when you woke, the sun was shining in your window and you wished you were somewhere else. So the kinds of words that are used are you, your, etc. And then finally, third person. This is where the narrator tells the story as it's occurring to somebody else or other people. For example, When Henry woke, the sun was streaming into the window and he wished he was somewhere else. So 3 different styles of perspective that you can choose from. Number 1 is most common for the recount, and I would actually recommend that you save the first person for the recount, because with your text production tasks, you've got to show within your 3 text production tasks, you've got to show your marker and your moderator that you can write in a range of different styles. So if you're feeling brave, you can have a go at second person, which is a tricky style of perspective to write from and to be successful in. Third person would be my suggestion of the perspective that you would write from, because it's going to be different from your recount, which will be first person. So writing about a character as though things are happening to them. So maybe take that down as a note, probably something important to remember, that third person is recommended for this task. Okay, narrative viewpoint, a little bit different. Sorry, these 2 slides should have been switched around. Every story is told from a particular point of view, the narrative viewpoint, also called the narrative perspective. So that's the 3 that we've just gone through: first person, second person, and third person. The second thing to consider with your perspective is how much the narrator knows. There are 2 different styles of third person narration. The first one, you might be able to cast your mind back to year 10 when we did The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, and we talked about these 2 different styles of narrators. So the first one is the omniscient narrator. This is where the narrator sees and knows everything, including all of the characters' thoughts. So remember, this is where a narrator would be able to jump around between characters and explain everything that's going through their mind and everything that they're thinking. The more common style of narration to use is the restricted narrator. This is where the narrator does not see and know everything. How much they know can vary. They might tell the story through the eyes of 1 or 2 characters, or they might be limited to reporting only what they see and hear personally. So often with this restricted narrator, it's a very common style of narration. It's used in The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, it's used in Harry Potter, it's used in a lot of fictional books. The narrator tells from third person, so they're writing about a character, and they can only see into the main character's mind. So they can only read the thoughts and the feelings of the main character. And for the other characters, it's almost a description of the main character guessing how the other characters are feeling through their body language, through what they're saying, and through what this person thinks they might be feeling. Okay, let's move on. So you as a writer, you've got the opportunity to choose the following things for your narrative. You can either choose a linear or a non-linear narrative structure. You can choose the style of the narrative voice and the attitudes and beliefs of the narrator. You can choose first person, second person, or third person narrative perspective. Remember that my suggestion was to use third person, which would be the easiest and the most successful, but you can have a go at second person and first person as well, but I think you should save that for your recount. And you can use the limited or the omniscient narration, or past or present tense. Because you're writing a historical narrative about something said in the past, again, I would suggest to use past tense, so that it's clear that you're writing about a setting from the past. So there's that's some more information about narrative writing. There's some tips for you. Please make sure you've taken notes on this video, because I'm going to be talking to you about this information in our next lesson. Okay, thanks Year 12s. Bye.